Good evening. More than 500,000 workers are set to go on strike tomorrow in Britain's biggest day of industrial action in over a decade. There will be significant disruption, according to Downing Street, as train drivers, bus drivers, civil servants, teachers, university staff and other workers withdraw their labour. The strikes could affect more than 23,000 schools in the first of 7 planned days of action by teachers across England and Wales. And the strikes by teachers in part of Scotland continue. The Schools Minister for England said he expected the majority of schools to be open in some capacity. But many head teachers say it's almost impossible to plan without knowing how many staff will be on strike. Our education editor, Bronwyn Jeffries, has more details.
Morning, everybody.
Greeting parents each morning, answering questions about strikes. This primary just outside Leeds city centre hopes to be partly open, not least for all the working parents.
If they go on strike, I think it's not good for kids. Any day missing school will definitely affect their education. I don't have anybody to look after my child. If this happens, I have to make a plan.
I'm working, my husband is working. I'm lucky to work hybrid, so I can do some arrangements to be for a few days. This is how I will show my support to the teachers.
What is our first step?
Schools have been told to stay open if possible. Here, teachers belong to different unions. Under half belong to the union going on strike tomorrow. Some schools already know they have to close, but for many others there's going to be huge uncertainty right up to tomorrow morning. That's because the school gets told how many union members there are, but the head teacher won't know for certain how many are going to go out on strike. The head teacher is most concerned about vulnerable children, the pupils who fell behind during COVID.
We've had lots of questions from working parents who've asked what will they do with their children on that day, and obviously we've reassured them that if they are key worker parents, then we can support them. If they're parents with vulnerable children, we can support those families also. But inevitably there are some families who aren't key workers, and they will unfortunately have to make their own provision if the school was to close. The situation is so dynamic that we are almost unable to plan for every eventuality.
What about in terms of the size of the population?
2 miles away, this secondary school will also mainly close as support for the strikes has grown. It's only Year 11s facing GCSEs who will definitely be in. So I wanted to know what Emmanuel and Naomi think about the strikes.
Even in our school, we see that teachers are staying until maybe 6, until 7, marking books. And that's many hours. So I'm feeling sympathy for the teachers, but at the same time, boys and mocks at GCSEs.
Considering that we're in Year 11, because we just came out of COVID and we're just getting back into routine with school and everything, I think it's going to disrupt our learning in a way.
The progression isn't there for teachers.
For Helen, a science teacher, strikes are a last resort after a decade of her pay falling in value.
It's so important to get a good education, and yet we're not valuing the people who give the children that education. Teachers are leaving in droves. The new teachers are not being retained. Teachers can't be recruited. Experienced teachers are leaving. And, you know, this has never been the case. People used to leave the private sector to come be teachers because it was a good job to have.
This secondary is in a group of 12 schools. Only one of those schools expects to open fully, but they won't know who's striking until morning.
Going on strike is not the way to conduct pay negotiations in a modern economy, particularly when it means disrupting a child's education and disrupting the lives of families up and down the country.
Schools face 3 more days of disruption in coming weeks. So far, talks between unions and ministers in both England and Wales show no sign of progress. Bronwyn Jeffries, BBC News, Leeds.
Well, more strikes have been announced during the day, with ambulance workers in parts of England saying that they'll be taking action at the end of next week, and thousands of Environment Agency workers will also strike next Wednesday over pay. Indeed, the prime cause of most of the strikes is pay at a time of sharply rising cost of living, but there are other factors involved as well. Our business editor, Simon Jack, is here with us to explain a little more. Simon.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Yes, as you were saying, the TUC say they're expecting up to 500,000 workers to take strike action tomorrow, the biggest single day of walkouts in the recent spate of industrial action, which will see groups including teachers join, nurses, firefighters and many more. They all walk out over the coming weeks. Now, the last few months have seen 1.6 million working days lost to strike, probably nearer 2 million now, to be honest. That's the most since the early 1990s. Why? As Hugh said, it's not all about pay. There are disputes about changing terms, conditions, working practices, but at the heart of it is this. Average basic pay in the private, but particularly the public sector, is just not keeping up with the rising cost of living. But union leaders say these tensions have been brewing for a long time.
This has been a problem that's been 10 years, 11 years, 12 years in the making, not just 12 months in the making. We've had a decade now of falling real wages. The average worker in the UK, £4,000 a year worse off than if pay would have just kept pace with inflation since 2008. So there's something broken in the UK economy.
Now, there have been some breakthroughs. Some BT workers accepted a rise of up to 16%, depending on their role. Arriva bus drivers accepted 11%. Predominantly, these are in the private sector. Others still appear deadlocked. A pay offer of 9% over tiers has not been accepted by most rail workers, and firefighters are striking, having rejected a 5% pay rise. But is this the moment of maximum leverage for unions? Inflation may have peaked, and some think the government may be prepared to wait until the case for higher pay deals looks harder to make, even though the recent decline in living standards will be permanent.
We're probably at the peak now of inflation, and I think it's quite possible that private sector pay may start to slow as well. The growth in private sector pay may slow. And so if both of those start to fall through the middle of the year, then I think it is going to be, the risk is that it's going to be harder to sort of make the case for pay rises of 8 or 10% if private sector pay and inflation are both below that. But of course, it is that cumulative effect of high inflation over the last couple of years that is really hitting kind of public sector wages particularly hard.
Like in previous decades, union leaders have recently become household names in the last few months. You may recognise the RMT leader Mick Lynch there. But their influence, their reach is arguably less than in those previous decades. Union membership reached 13.2 million in the late 1970s, but it's since fallen to about 6.5 million now. The government is also trying to make it harder to strike. A bill to require higher minimum service levels and a higher proportion of members voting to trigger a strike is making its way through Parliament. Unions have called this a spiteful, their words, bit of legislation that will sour industrial relations further. This isn't the 1970s when 20 million days were lost over a 6-month period to strikes, but there is no easy end to the discord in the near future. Hugh.
Simon, many thanks again. Simon Jack there, our business editor.